Hey, hello, students. This is Professor Gore. We are today going to be covering the second part of the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution kind of PowerPoint lecture. So, in the first part of this, we talked about the Articles of Confederation and some of the good parts of the Articles of Confederation, the bad stuff. So, to kind of recap from that, the Articles of Confederation was successful in the sense that it held all 13 states together both throughout the American Revolution and for the years after it was adopted into till about 1787, 1789, when the Constitution was fully implemented. So that's a good thing. Secondly, it helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris, 1783, and also passed the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. But if you remember from the previous lecture, Shays' Rebellion was a turning point for the Articles of Confederation, eventually being kind of out the door because it showed that our current government was not up to date to basically be able to handle that kind of problem. So you'll see what the Constitution does. It's not perfect, but what it does is it ends up actually kind of fixing a lot of the mistakes of the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation didn't have an executive branch. The Constitution is going to establish that. You had to have 9 out of 13 states to ratify something. It gets lowered to just over 50%. The Constitution also makes it where you can amend it. And it also creates a taxation policy. If you remember, that was the greatest weakness of the Articles of Confederation, didn't have ability to tax. So why a new Constitution? Well, as I mentioned, those things we just mentioned. It was also too weak to protect life, liberty, and property, which is things that John Locke advocated in the Enlightenment. They realized that with the Shays' Rebellion and the conflict that emerged over taxes and so forth in Western Massachusetts. So it basically Shays' Rebellion provided that evidence that something needs to happen. So they originally said they were going to meet in Annapolis, Maryland. Not every state was represented, so they realized it was a bad time of the year. So they agreed to reconvene later when it was in between the harvest time and planting season, so wealthy planters could attend and so forth. They decided to meet in Philadelphia in 1787, and that summer is when they agreed to what becomes the United States Constitution. So we talked about Shays' Rebellion, and just mentioned the Annapolis Convention. Basically, George Washington even offered to offer a kind of a conference at his home in Mount Vernon. I've actually been there when I was 11. Beautiful home on the Potomac River, but basically it's a process over 1785 to 1786 to finally they meet in Philadelphia in 1787. So the Annapolis Convention, which was originally meant to potentially revise the Articles of Confederation, only 5 states sent delegates, so you're not going to have what you want accomplished if you only have 5 states that show up. So Alexander Hamilton and James Madison are going to be 2 kind of power players at the Constitutional Convention, are going to convince the states to end up having an official convention to be held in Philadelphia, which is also where the Declaration of Independence and the First Continental, Second Continental Congress and so forth met. So you'll see that Shays' Rebellion showed a weakness, too much state power, not enough federal power. The Constitution is going to fix that by creating a stronger central government. And so the problem is, though, and it's going to be a huge debate, how much power should the federal government have? And you'll see throughout U.S. history, the power of the federal government is going to kind of ebb and flow. At times, it's going to be far less and does very little, particularly like in some of the parts of the Gilded Age. And then at times it's going to wield tremendous power depending on who's president, what kind of Congress you have, what is the issues of the day. For instance, the federal government's going to swell to be pretty big during World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, because of times of crises and so forth. And so we'll see how that will play out if you take U.S. history too as well. So the original purpose in Philadelphia is actually not to create a new governing document. It's to revise the Articles of Confederation. Once they start revising it, they realize this thing sucks. Let's get rid of it and let's create something new. And that's exactly what they actually do. So here is Independence Hall. You can go visit it. It's a pretty popular spot and one of the most popular spots to visit in Philadelphia. I've never been to Philadelphia, so I can't say I've actually been there to see it myself. But about 55 delegates representing their states came. A couple influential founding fathers were not there, such as Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. They were both serving as ambassadors, Jefferson to France and Adams to England at the time. And so the goal basically is to create a government that's not like the one they left with the American Revolution and with King George. They don't want a monarchy. They don't want a parliament they felt like had become too powerful. But the big balance is, how do you balance state and federal government power? And that's known as federalism. And so with federalism, you end up having some things are left up to the states and some things are left up to the federal government. So, for instance, education had never been in the federal government's in the Constitution. Only later, when we get to the 1960s, does the federal government start intervening in education. That was always something that was left up to the states. Okay, so you'll have some things that'll be left up to the states, and you still have that way today, and then some things are left up to the federal government. So we'll see how that balance kind of plays out. But the Constitution is going to create the power to tax. It is going to create the power to regulate trade. It is going to create the power to protect private property, okay, which the Fifth Amendment does. But there's a kind of an exception to the Fifth Amendment. It's called eminent domain. If when you take a government class, you'll definitely talk about eminent domain. That the federal government has the right to basically have you sell your land at a fair market price, so long as that land is being used for the public good or purpose. So, for instance, like if building interstate highways in the 1950s, they had to purchase private property to be able to do that. And if they didn't want to sell to put I-40 or I-30 right through it, then they could use eminent domain to force them to sell that. Now the federal government has to pay them a fair market value for their property, but they do have to sell. You also enforce its laws. In fact, that is one of the biggest jobs of the president, is to enforce the laws of the land. But at the same time, do not take away the rights that Americans have fought for in the American Revolution. That's a big thing. And that's why the Bill of Rights ends up getting passed after the Constitutional Convention as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So let's talk about who these delegates actually are. And so they don't want a mobocracy, which they feared with things like Shays' Rebellion. They want a balance of power, a federal government that can put down insurrection and rebellion, but at the same time also grants and protects liberties for the average American citizen. And so they start over. So we usually like to say that the founding fathers were well read, well led, and well fed, which means well read. They were the most educated people in the colonies, typically. Well led means they came from influential families. And then lastly, well fed means they were wealthy. So these representatives were some of the most high class members of society for that day and age. Ben Franklin's the oldest delegate there. He's in his 80s. He passed away pretty soon after. George Washington becomes the president of the convention, even though he doesn't really have any earth-shattering ideas that shape the Constitution. Really, one of the big players that really shapes the Constitution is our fourth president, James Madison. Quiet, kind of shy, mild-mannered man, but brilliant mind. Graduated from Princeton and really helped shape a lot of our Constitution. So really his big lasting achievement in American history, more so than his presidency and handling the War of 1812. So this is from a quote from James Madison, where he talks about the writing of the Constitution formed a task more difficult than can be well conceived by those who were not concerned in the execution of it. Adding to the difficulty of the natural diversity of human opinions on all new and complicated subjects, it is impossible to consider the degree of concord which ultimately prevailed as less than a miracle. So James Madison is considered the father of the Constitution because he comes up with some of the big parts of it. He doesn't come up with everything by any means. He's not the sole writer of the Constitution like Jefferson was with the Declaration of Independence, but a lot of the Bill of Rights he helped write with Alexander Hamilton and others. And so he does believe in a stronger central government. Now, I don't know if they envision the way the federal government operates now, but then again, it was the 1780s. History and what's going on in the world is a lot different than what's going on in the world now. And so he does write part of the Federalist Papers, which we'll cover later, which is a series of papers arguing for the ratification of the Constitution. And so that's really this debate over the Constitution being ratified creates the first two political parties in American history. All right, so let's look on the facts of the framers. You can see from this pie chart kind of the breakdown. Law and farming. A lot of times lawyers like John Adams were also farmers as well. They would use farming to supplement some of their income if they had sporadic income with law practice. But you can see there's only just a few doctors, and then people that maybe held law or public office. Some big planters, about 8 of them, 9 just sole lawyers, and about 12 of them were just business owners or merchants or something. You can see also the amount of slave owners that are there. So these are the biggest number of slave owners that were present. So out of the 55 members of the Constitutional Convention, a good number did own slaves. That's going to be interesting because the federal government had a chance to get rid of slavery in 1787, and it failed to do so. And that's going to be a thorn in the side of the United States and be one of the biggest issues, if not the biggest issue in American history, will be slavery and race relations in American history. So George Mason, Virginia had the most slaves, which you have George Mason University today. You also have George Washington. He does free his slaves upon his death. Actually, it's supposed to be on the death of his wife, but Martha ends up freeing them because worried that they were going to kill her. And so you do have some. James Madison, it's kind of interesting. He was a slave owner. He had one slave, and his slave was actually well educated and actually really liked James Madison. Didn't like his wife, Dolly, which is interesting because Dolly was considered like the life of the party, one of the most famous first ladies in American history, but he did not speak very highly of her in his diary, but spoke very highly of James, who I think freed him upon his death. But it's kind of interesting, that relationship, if you have time to read it later on at some point in your life. It also shows the age. The youngest delegate was 27. The oldest delegate was Ben Franklin, 81. So the average age, you can tell, is in the early 40s. Those that went to college, and in the sense that just because you didn't go to college doesn't mean you were well educated or you were not well educated. Oftentimes they would have private tutors, even if they didn't attend college. So they had fine education up to a certain point in their life instead of actually going on to a university. You can see Princeton had the most graduates of any of the founding fathers. So typically we're white, well, they were all white male adults. They all owned land, all had at least some education, so they wouldn't have been invited if they weren't literate. Some were slave owners, but not all. A lot of them were lawyers, or at least had some kind of legal training, and a lot of them were merchants or businessmen. So the big debate that really takes off first is, all right, how should you handle representation in Congress? So the Articles of Confederation had a one-house Congress. How many houses should you have? So it's either one or two. They weren't arguing for three. And then on top of that, how do you determine representation? Is it based on every state gets an equal number of representatives, or is it based on population? And so this is what's called the Connecticut Compromise, or what's called the Great Compromise at the Articles or at the Constitutional Convention. So large states such as Massachusetts and Virginia argued that you should have representation based on population in Congress. So, hey, we're a bigger state, we should have a bigger say. That's fair. Small states were like, well, we don't want to be dominated by the larger states, so we should have equal representation. So what ends up happening is they propose a compromise, hence the Great Compromise, and we have both. You have the House of Representatives that is based on population. So if you're in California, you have the most representatives in the House of Representatives. Texas, New York, and others have they're close behind it. You have like Arkansas, a smaller state in terms of population, have less representatives. And then in the Senate, which is of the two branches of Congress is the more powerful one, every state's going to have two. And so as each state gets added, you have two more senators that get added to the U.S. Senate. And so you'll have taxation policies begin in the House and then be passed ultimately by the Senate. So they wanted to create taxation policies to begin based on population with the House of Representatives, and then taxation to be fully decided on by the Senate, which is equal representation. So you have, it really is a good compromise when it's all said and done. So the Virginia plan, if you want to kind of compare this, what it actually proposed, it wanted a national government, three branches, what we have: executive, legislative, and judicial. Wanted a bicameral Congress, and then people elect, say, the House of Representatives, and then the other house is elected by the um, the um, the House of Representatives. So, for instance, instead of just having both the House and the Senate elected by the people, which is what we have today, you would have, with the Virginia plan, proposed that the House of Representatives be elected by the people, and then the House of Representatives itself would then elect the Senate. And we don't have that today. So the New Jersey plan, though, proposed by smaller states such as New Jersey, they wanted one House legislature, similar to the Articles of Confederation, and each state to have one vote and equal representation. So they kind of combine the plans and really come up with a pretty good compromise. So, what's the role of Congress? Okay, so House of Representatives is going to be elected directly by the people. Representations based on population, and as common sense would kick in, the more population you have, the more representatives you have, and they only serve 2-year terms. Okay, the more important branch of Congress is the Senate, which is a much bigger deal if you're a senator versus a member of the House of Representatives, because there's only 2 from every state, where there might be several from the House of Representatives. Originally, it's going to be this way until you have the 17th Amendment, which we'll cover in the second half of U.S. history. When we get to the progressive era, senators were elected by the state legislatures, and that's significant. And so you don't have direct election of senators directly by the people until you get to the 1910s with the passing of the 17th Amendment. And that's a big deal when that was passed. So it gives more power to the people, more popular sovereignty. But at this time, they didn't want full, they're worried about mob rule and so forth. So they made it where the Senate was elected by the state legislatures. And at times that there's going to be corruption with that. People that would become senators in the Gilded Age would recall the Millionaires Club, because they could give money to the local state legislatures to be appointed as a senator. Some were elected legitimately, but others were elected illegitimately and so forth. They serve a 6-year term, so you don't serve as, you don't have to run for reelection as often. And so you serve a longer term in the Senate than you do in the House. Okay. So also, how do we limit the power of the government? But we need to give it enough power for it to be effective. So what they did is they basically broke the government up into 3 branches. All right, so what's the role of the executive, and what's the role of the legislative, and what's the role of the judicial branch? Okay, so the executive branch is designed to enforce the laws of the land. The president can push for something to be passed, but Congress actually has to pass it. The president does have a check on Congress's power by the presidential veto, but you don't want to have a dictatorial king potentially. So they created a balance of power by allowing Congress to be able to basically override that veto with 2/3 vote. So it checks the president, what ends up happening. So that's a good thing. The judicial branch, what is their role? So the president decides who appoints a Supreme Court judge, but then Congress actually decides whether they're actually going to be able to serve, and they vote to allow them to serve. How does the judicial branch check the legislative branch? Well, the judicial branch can judge whether something passed by Congress is constitutional or not, and that's called judicial review, and that'll be established when we get to the third module when we talk about Marbury versus Madison. So that's a big deal. All right. So legislative branch makes the law, executive branch carries out the law, judicial branch interprets the law. That's a kind of the elementary version of this. You'll get a lot more depth if you ever take a government class. And so there's checks and balances. Okay. You also have there's 6 constitutional principles. And if we were taking a state tested assessment for U.S. history, we would talk about these 6 things much more in depth. But you have what's called separation of powers. So power divided up between the 3 branches of government. Federalism, which is a balance between some things are up to the federal government, some things are up to the states. You also have what's called popular sovereignty, which people get to vote on things, such as their representatives in the House. They also get to vote on the presidency. But then you also have electoral college, which ultimately decides who is going to win the presidency. Now, traditionally, throughout history, the electoral college votes in the way that the state votes. So however many representatives you have from that state, they will cast their vote according to popular vote of the state for a candidate. Okay. So you have that. You also will have a couple other aspects of constitutional principles that we'll talk about a little bit later. All right, so we've covered this. You can read over this if you'd like. This is more of a governmental stuff, but we're just going over the highlights. Okay. Now, another big argument with the Constitutional Convention is what do you do about slavery? And this is going to be one of the really the downfall in some ways of the Constitution, or I should say the big mistake of the Constitution, they didn't handle it. So if you read the Constitution, if you read it and you did not know what you were reading, you'd have no idea that slavery exists in our country. Okay, and they assumed that slavery was eventually going to die out because slavery had been severely weakened after the American Revolution, and really tobacco profitability and rice, some of that had gone down. But what changes things is in the 1790s, the invention of the cotton gin. We'll cover that a little bit later in another lecture. And also with the development of the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, with this demand for cotton textiles, slavery begins to take off tremendously. And it forever changed the course of history. So Southerners at the Constitutional Convention argued that, hey, wait a minute, we should have slavery determine our population or help contribute our population. And the Northerners are like, wait a minute. How does that determine your population when they're not citizens, they don't have the right to vote? And so a guy named Gouverneur Morris brought this issue up to hopefully get rid of it. His goal was to get rid of slavery. But unfortunately, it doesn't happen. To safeguard property rights, Morris demanded life terms for senators, a property qualification for voting in national elections, and strong president with veto power. Morris was an advocate of free markets and personal liberty, but he condemned slavery as a nefarious institution. Southern delegates joined together to defend slavery, cutting its long history and continuing economic importance, but they disagreed on the issue of the Atlantic slave trade. So what was in it proposed? Now, George Mason, who had the most slaves at the Constitutional Convention, argued that, all right, well, then we should ban the importation of slaves. So they agreed upon the Constitutional Convention that in 1807, not 1907, 1807, there'd be no more new slaves imported. Now, there were some that were smuggled in, but for the most part, slavery and the slave population increases from natural reproduction. So George Mason was representing planters in the Chesapeake region who already owned ample number of slaves. Rice planters from South Carolina and Georgia, however, argued that slave imports must continue, otherwise their states shall not be parties to the Union. At that insistence, Congress could not stop the Atlantic slave trade until about 1807, 1808 time period. The delegates also made two more compromises. To satisfy Southern slave owners, they agreed to a fugitive clause that allowed masters to reclaim enslaved blacks or white indentured servants, because there was still indentured servanthood at this time, even as late as the 1780s, who fled to other states. Acknowledging the anti-slavery sentiments of Morris and other Northerners, the delegates refused to mention slavery explicitly in the Constitution. Mistake, big time. So how did they use slaves to determine representation? So Northern states wanted to abolish slavery, rightfully so. In fact, Northern states are going to lead this abolitionist movement later when we get to the 1850s and the latter half of U.S. History 1. And so Southern states argued they would break away from the Union if they abolished slavery. Okay, so the Three-Fifths Compromise, probably the most infamous compromise of the convention. So the biggest compromise is dealing with Congress and how they're going to determine small states versus large states. The Three-Fifths Compromise was probably the most infamous of the compromises. So basically how it works, to give more representation to the southern states, this is probably the most bogus thing in the Constitution, for every 5 slaves that a southern state had, 3 of them would count towards the overall population. So it gives Southerners more representation in Congress through the House of Representatives, even though they had overall less what was considered citizens, because they didn't consider slaves as citizens at that time. If it sounds messed up, that's because it is. So 3 out of every 5 slaves could count as part of the state's total population. So to give you an example, to round off numbers, if Georgia had a population of about 300,000 white people, 100,000 slaves, that would basically give them an extra 60,000 people total for their overall population. Okay. And the Three-Fifths Compromise was controversial at that time. and it's controversial later. Now, one thing that's going to be controversial that will be an issue throughout U.S. history until the Civil War, and that's the fugitive slave law, because it was argued that Southerners who had lost their slaves should be able to reclaim them, much like they would a lost livestock animal. And a lot of the Northerners, who some didn't necessarily support slavery, but weren't necessarily all about abolishing it, they didn't want to have to be responsible for returning these slaves. And so what ends up happening is you end up having our Underground Railroad that develops, not a literal railroad, but basically a secret kind of ways for runaway slaves to kind of escape via safe houses up to the north, or they went down to Florida. A lot of them in the Deep South went down to Florida before it was bought out by the United States in 1819. So, and there'd be different ways they would signal on the Underground Railroad. You might have like a quilt hanging up on the clothesline that would signify it was a safe house. You could sleep during it a day and then travel at night and so forth. But we'll cover the Underground Railroad in a later lecture. And so the fifth and final major argument between the delegates was how to solve the problem of the states having more power than the federal government. And so they created the separation of powers, and they created federalism that divided up the some powers up to the states, some is up to the federal government. So if you ever look at the 10th Amendment, it's called the States' Rights Amendment. Basically, anything not in the Constitution is up to the states. Okay, so the states may not address anything, but if it's not in the Constitution, the states are supposed to handle it. That'll kind of be a hot button issue throughout U.S. history. So if you look right here, this is just kind of just a breakdown of like federal government, state, local, county, city. This is just a made up number, but gives you an idea of kind of the breakdown of the laws of the land and so forth. So these are powers expressly implied in the Constitution, okay, what they're literally giving, and what also things that what it means by implied, it doesn't necessarily specifically state, but what it does is it's implied that they could do that. So, for instance, later in U.S. history in the 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower decides to create and fund NASA because of the Cold War and the space race. We wanted to be able to try to beat the Russians or the Soviets into outer space, into the moon. They beat us in outer space, we beat them to the moon. Okay, so power shared by all three levels. That's local, state, and federal government level. And then power only given to the states. So originally, education was only supposed to be at the state level or the local level. And you can see the different things. Marriage definition was a state issue until the Oglethorpe Supreme Court decision a few years ago in the 2000s. All right, so instead of an 80% state power and then 20% federal power, now you have about 60% when the Constitution was originally created in the federal government's hands, and about 40% of the power held by the states. That's going to ebb and flow throughout U.S. history. Okay, so if you ever take government class, you'll talk about the three levels of government: national, state, local. Okay. So debate over ratification. This is what leads to the first two political parties in American history. So the Federalists favored strong federal government. They favored the Constitution because they liked it. But then you have anti-federalists, hence they're anti this increased federal government power, and they're opposed to the Constitution. The Constitution really was it was a close battle for it being ratified, and eventually it does have 9 states ratified, which is why it ends up getting implemented into law. And so the anti-federalists end up becoming this other party, their rival to the Federalists, known as Democrat Republicans. And we'll see, particularly when we get to the end of Module 2 and then a lot of Module 3, we'll talk about the battle between the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans, the first two political parties in American history. These are famous founders that were Federalist. And now, initially, James Madison was a Federalist until you get to the Alien and Sedition Acts, and we'll get to that when we get to John Adams' presidency in a later lecture. But that Madison eventually becomes a Democrat Republican. All right, so the Federalists, they felt like that it had gone too far. Some of them thought that the Articles of Confederation needed to be revised, but maybe not what the Constitution actually offers. So Patrick Henry, the famous guy who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," Thomas Jefferson and Sam Adams were all anti-Federalist. So how do you convince the states that they should ratify this governmental document. And so there's a series of papers called the Federalist Papers, about 85 essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and a guy named John Jay, who become the first. Jay becomes the first Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He also negotiated a couple of really important treaties, like the Treaty of Paris, 1783, and then Jay's Treaty. And so it eventually convinces majority of the population that the Constitution was good and that it should be implemented. So you can see which states ratified and which states did not. Some areas had no return. I mean, like Georgia was pretty sparsely populated, and most of western Georgia was controlled by the Cherokees. So, but you can see the places that did support it and those that did not, based on this map, to kind of idea of where and how it ends up getting passed. Delaware voted 30-0 because if you look at the small states voted in favor of it because it actually gave them equal power with the Senate and they were happy about it. Bigger states like Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts had a little different voting. New Jersey, unanimous, 38-0, baby. Georgia, small state at the time, 26-0. Connecticut, 128-40. Massachusetts, much closer vote because a much larger state in terms of population. Maryland, still pretty lopsided. South Carolina, New Hampshire ended up being the 9th state that ends up getting the Constitution officially implemented, and that's their claim to fame, and so forth. Virginia, very close vote because it's the largest state. New York, pretty close, and North Carolina, not that close. And then Rhode Island, they kind of forced Rhode Island to end up implementing it. All right, and we will come back to George Washington's presidency on the next lecture.